Okay, awesome. So first one, so many colors. And if you can't see, it says, you're not dead inside. Right? Really religious. Diagnosing a problem. You feel dead. And then giving you a solution. Let's flip to the next one. Someone to go to heaven with. And I don't know if this is like a rule of dating marketing ads or not, but none of the people who are embracing are kissing. And so I wonder if it's like the drinking commercials where you can't actually drink the beer. You just have to like look like you're drinking it. But anyways, it kind of generates the sense of longing, the sense of desire. And then my personal favorite, the next one, which is someone to save the planet with. And this robot-looking dude is made of like cans and stuff. So theoretically, the ad could say someone to recycle with, which I think is like a really interesting dating ad. So why do I bring this up? I feel like one of the weights of being a modern human being is that we don't know what we want. And even in addition to this, it's not only that we don't know what we want, but we don't know how to desire in the first place. We could conceive of wanting something, and we don't know how to genuinely desire it. And I don't think we don't pay careful attention enough to what are called the liturgies of our life. And liturgy comes from a Greek word, liturgia, which means the work of the people. And a liturgy is a ritual that you enact that gives you a sense of ultimate meaning. So for instance, I was recently at the Wrexham-Manchester United game. Awesome, so sick. The Wrexham star got his lung punctured and was hospitalized. So we're going to see that in the documentary if you want to see the Rob McElhenney, Ryan Reynolds documentary. San Diego drama. But at the beginning of the game, there's an American flag, a plane flies over, and you sing the national anthem. This is a liturgy, a ritual, that's pointing to your sense of the ultimate. It's saying your allegiance should be to this country. Now, in the same way, dating apps aren't bad. Use them, great. However, they do teach us something particular about what it means to be a human being. Because if their marketing is saying you're dead inside, you need someone to go to heaven with, and then they offer you a ritual, which is the sense of swiping through endless possibilities, then human beings begin to look primarily like something that is supposed to satisfy your needs. And then you can dispose of them if you swipe, or if they are marketed good enough and can fit enough of your needs, then you can introduce them to your life in some sense as a form of consumption. And so if we extrapolate this to what a human being is, we may start to treat the people in our lives through the liturgies and rituals that we enact as if they're disposable if they don't fit our needs enough, or they're products to be built for me. And either way, it's centered primarily about what we want and what we think we need. The author of The Little Prince said that if you want to get someone to build a ship, you have to teach them to desire the endless immensity of the sea. And so something as mundane and trivial as building a ship, just sort of another work of labor, you don't want to do that by telling someone to build a ship. You want to teach them this desire. You want to inspire that within them. And once they have that, then they'll go and build the ship. And what the good news says is that there was a human being who lived, and lived free of all rivalry, all competition, all need of external validation, emotionally co-regulated depression and anxiety with God in a way that was healthy and beautiful, that loved himself, loved God, and loved others, and lived a life of such radical sacrifice that he not only died, but went through the grave and came out the other side. And because God did this as a human being, this opens the possibilities that we may have human lives like that, free of protecting the egos that we so carefully construct for ourselves. And if that is not the equivalent of the endless immensity of the sea, I don't know what is. So we're going to be talking about desire, and we're going to be talking about what obstructs good and healthy and beautiful desire, and actually how to desire God. And the obstruction to this is what the Bible calls idolatry. So real brief recap of Israel's story. God has chosen this nation, Israel. They have become enslaved. God rescues them from slavery, identifies himself as the God who is on the side of the poor, forgotten, and forsaken. And then he brings them out into the wilderness, and he wants to give them what are called the 10 sayings, this revelation of who he is and who he's designed them to be. We're going to get more into that in a second. And then we're going to read this story, because this is what happens next. So they're on their way to the promised land, which basically is a story about finding home. They're on their way to home, and they get a tad bit distracted. So let's throw that up. When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." Aaron answered them, "Take off the gold earrings that your wives and your sons and your daughters are wearing, and bring them to me." So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. He took what they handed him and made it into an idol and cast it in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. I can't get into why it was a calf. I promise there's a really good answer for that. Talk to me after if you want it, but it's not relevant for what I'm going to say. Then they said, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf and announced, "Tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord." So the next day, the people rose up early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings. Afterwards, they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go down, because your people whom you brought up out of Egypt have become corrupt. They have been quick to turn away from what I commanded them and have made themselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf. They have bowed down to it and sacrificed to it and said, 'These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt.'" Quick skip in the verse. "And then when Moses approached the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, his anger burned, and he threw the tablets out of his hands, breaking them to pieces at the foot of the mountain. And he took the calf the people had made and burned it in the fire." This is my favorite part. "He ground it to powder, scattered it on the water, and made the Israelites drink it." Which is pretty badass. He said to Aaron, "What did these people do to you that you led them into such great sin?" "Do not be angry, my lord," Aaron answered. "You know how prone these people are to evil." Immediately blame someone else. "They said to me, 'Make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him.' So I told them, 'Whoever has any gold jewelry, take it off.' Then they gave me the gold, and I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf." Moses saw that the people were running wild and that Aaron had let them get out of control and so become a laughingstock to their enemies. So he stood at the entrance to the camp and said, "Whoever is for the Lord, come to me." And all the Levites rallied to him. And that's where the passage ends for us. What happens after that is there's a lot of killing and a massacre and a slaughter. Old Testament violence has been a problem for the early church since its very beginning. And there's a lot of interpretation about how we reconcile some of the violent pictures of God to the non-violent Jesus, who's revealed as the one who is executed in the New Testament. I don't have time to get into that, so again, we can talk for hours after the message if you would so like. So we're going to pay attention to certain parts of the text, because the more we attend and notice the text, the more it attends and notices us. So the first thing is that when Aaron makes this idol, he says, "Here is your God, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." Now, if you grew up in evangelical subculture, people all the time are like, "Don't worship false gods." And you're like, what does that mean? Like, am I? Who knows? Like, I'm not making idols for myself and like dancing around them. And what's interesting about this particular story is I'm going to be using the word idolatry, but it's not quite an idol insofar as a different God, because they're actually looking at this icon and saying, "This is your God who brought you up out of Egypt." So the problem here is that it's not a false God, but a domesticated deity. A domesticated deity. So the Israelites pour all their treasures into this mold, comes out this golden calf, and as if surprised, they say, "Here is your God," as if they had not determined what the outcome would be themselves. And so we have to be very careful that we don't want God to be who we would want God to be, rather than to let God be who God is. And so we're going to talk about what is this idolatry and what it does to our picture of God and our picture of human beings. And so there's going to be a lot of an onus on you to examine your life, to look at the daily rituals you have, to see what might be pointing you away from God and the love that's at the heart of the universe. And so idolatry, most importantly, has to do with our attention. Because if God is the ultimate, the transcendent source of all that is, from where you came and to where you're going, your true home, then misusing your attention is not having the correct picture of human thriving. And so this leads me to my first official point, which is this. Idolatry objectifies God and reduces God to our demands, expectations, and desires. So what in our lives reduces God to an object who is useful for us? Idolatry asks how God can fit into my life rather than how my life might fit into God's. So again, what are those practices that say you're actually the center and everything around you rotates and centers and orbits around your needs and your wants? And as people who follow Jesus, we need to be careful that we don't subject the divine, the God who is beyond all of us, to our conditions for experiencing him. Because we may say, well, if we worship enough, God will show up. If we read the Bible enough, God will show up. If we have a dope fog machine, God is going to be here, okay? We can't do that because that submits God to our expectations of how he's going to show up. And so idolatry is either treating yourself as the determiner of your reality, as you get to decide what you want and what you desire, or treating God as yourself. So that God says yes to everything you say yes to. God says no to everything you say no to. And Rowan Williams says this, one of my favorite authors. He says, Israel's hostility to idols is a measure of the recognition that what I make to meet my needs cannot set me free, cannot give me a new and assured reality. So what he's saying in this first part is that I cannot get what I need on my own. I cannot set myself free from death or that which enslaves me and makes me less than human on my own. And so he says, the eyes of the idol are my own, looking back at me, which is the looking and the designing of rituals that point back to me as what is most important. An example of this, you may have heard the cliche, maybe you've said it, maybe perhaps we've all said it at some point, I'm spiritual, not religious. That is an idolatrous statement because it's saying you want the transcendent, the universal, that which is beyond everything, but you don't want it to bind you to other people in practice or community. You want the universal and transcendent, but you want to decide what it looks like. You want God, but you just want God for yourself. And the church counters this as hopefully a community that is freeing ourselves and being freed by God from idolatry to lean more into the life and dream God has for us and more into commitment for and with each other, which is how we learn to give and receive compassionate life. So idolatry looks like living a life of obsessive action, where we amuse ourselves to death. And when our amusements and coping mechanisms disappear, we become terribly afraid. But that moment can be a holy moment if we open our hearts to let God in, to be vulnerable with God in that sort of moment. And so as followers of Jesus, how do we demand that God fulfill our needs and wants? And in what ways do we subject God to how we might wish God to be? One of my favorite authors in the 20th century, I didn't put this quote on here. He says, I believe in Jesus because he fulfills none of my dreams and because everything in my being cries out, crucify him. And if you don't hate God sometimes, you may not be worshiping him. Because God is not how we would wish him to be, and asks us to do things, to love, to sacrifice in ways that we would not normally inclined to do. And he also gives grace to people who we would never do that, right? Jesus is like, hey, die for your enemies. And you're like, you know what? Maybe I don't need a savior. I'm cool today, actually. So the next part of the text that we're going to pay attention to is when Aaron is confronted by Moses. And he's like, dude, I put this gold in and like out came this calf. That's like me like trying to paint and then just being like, and it happened to be the Mona Lisa, like pixel perfect. It's crazy, right? It's denying the consequences of an idolatrous life. It's denying the causal connection between our daily rituals and liturgies and what actually those eventuate in, which is normally disintegration from ourselves, disintegration from God, and disintegration from each other. And Moses' response to this is burning the calf and making them drink it, which is so cool. And most people who know this story don't remember that part. I think it's the coolest part of the story, because what Moses is teaching them is that you become what you love, which is one of my points. We become what we love. We become what we attend to, and we become what we worship, which is why we have to be so careful about where our attention is being given. And Psalm 115:8 says, those who make idols will be like them, and so will all who trust in them. I have another quotation from one of my favorite authors, N.T. Wright. He says, when human beings give their heartfelt allegiance to and worship that which is not God, they progressively cease to reflect the image of God. One of the primary laws of human life is that you become like what you worship. What's more, you reflect what you worship not only to the object itself, but also outward to the world around. So in this sense, there's no private action or private belief. Those who worship money increasingly define themselves in terms of it, and increasingly treat other people as creditors, debtors, partners, or customers, rather than as human beings. Those who worship sex define themselves in terms of it, their preferences, their practices, their past histories, and increasingly treat other people as actual or potential sex objects. Those who worship power define themselves in terms of it, and treat other people as either collaborators, competitors, or pawns. These and many other forms of idolatry combine in 1,000 ways, all of them damaging to the image-bearing quality of the people concerned and of those whose lives they touch. So idolatry does not only present us with a false picture of God, but a fictional humanity. Because if you treat God as an object to be controlled and determined by your desire, then you also have a picture of human beings that you attempt to treat as objects for your use. And so our definition of the ultimate of God provides our definition of humanity. I was recently, right before I went to Scotland, driving past Invictus, the gym right over there. And I have some friends who go to that gym, so I'm not going to trash it or anything. But I was driving past it, and this woman pulled parallel just directly into my car. And I didn't know that at first, so I just heard this large doof, and I was like, I thought I dumped the bodies. But apparently, and so she hit the car, and it was fine. Like, it didn't damage it at all. But I came out, and she was like so sad, wearing all this Invictus gear. I was like, it's fine, be free, we're good. But what I think is so ironic about this is that on the side of their building, they have what I think is a Dylan Thomas quote. I can't remember. But it says, I am the master of my fate and the captain of my destiny. And I was like, were you the master of your fate when you like pulled straight into my car? Were you the captain of your destiny? Did you decide on that? Did you decide on that? Because I think we have these illusions that we're so much more in control than we are, right? But you didn't choose when you're going to be born. You didn't choose what body you have, what parents you have, and you're not going to choose when you're going to die. And so we are a lot more out of control than we think we are. I will never be a professional NBA player, regrettably. I can never dunk on the haters. No one will ever be the best soccer player in history because Lionel Messi already exists, okay? So there's a lot we can't do. But this fictional humanity teaches us that we create ourselves, that we're in control and never will have our desires or wants questioned or challenged. I was also recently listening to a talk Google gave about their new tool, the Magic Eraser. And I was just like, I saw ads for it. I was like, this is completely innocent, right? Like there's some homie in the background you don't want, just like click them out, whatever. But I was listening to the CEO talk about this tool. And the way he employed using it, the way he explained it, was that if you look at a picture you had, and he said, and you don't remember the day, or you remember it as sunnier than it was, you can erase the clouds. So if you have a picture and it didn't match what your memory of it is, you can just take out the clouds, make it a sunnier day than it was. This is a version of idolatry. Because what it's saying is I can't reconcile myself or shouldn't reconcile myself to the fact that this is disappointing, that the day wasn't how I remembered it. That I shouldn't reconcile myself to the fact that my memory can be false, but that I can actually create the exact reality I want, even recreate the past and recreate history to match my needs and my demands. And all of this is a failing to love how God would want us to love, which actually is what Moses is doing at the top of the mountain. And so he gets these 10 sayings. You've heard of them called the 10 Commandments. That word can be translated 10 sayings, 10 affirmations, 10 commandments. And 5 of them are about loving God. And 5 of them are about loving human beings. As if to say, unless you get your picture of God right, unless you love God rightly, you can never actually truly love another human being rightly. And the Christian message in this is that there was a God who was a human being, who loved us as God did, but also as human beings should, so that we can enter the divine life, even in God-forsakenness, wherever you are, as a human being. And God had already given them an identity. He'd already freed them from slavery. They didn't have to earn that. So don't hear me as if I'm saying, like, follow the rules or God will get you. He frees them from slavery and then gives them an identity free of charge and says, this is how you live this identity out. So God speaks over you. You are holy. You are chosen. You are loved. And I've been waiting every day until you came to be. And I find great joy in you. And to truly enjoy that, to truly live up to what you've already attained, here's the way I want you to live and to treat each other. And so lastly, let's think for a second about these daily rituals, these rhythms that have ultimacy inscribed in them. So for instance, what I've been struggling with is I'll usually, super mundane, roll out of my bed, check my phone, rather than say a quick prayer beforehand. And what this is saying is that I care more about connecting with other human beings or meeting the demands of work or whatever than I do connecting with God. What is normal forms us. And as the author of this beautiful book, Ordinary Liturgy, Tish Harrison Warren, she says, the crucible of our formation is the monotony of our daily routines. And there's a verse from one of the prophets that says, God is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him. And so what ways in your life are you avoiding silence? And not necessarily like quiet time with God in like the evangelical devotional sense, but contemplation. Just being with yourself and with God alone. The Eucharist, in one way, the communion, which you take every other week, is an anti-idol. Because the Eucharist, in its consumption, we actually become the body of Christ. And that's what the liturgy speaks of. You eat it and you become the body of Christ. And so it teaches us that we actually belong to God and belong to each other, rather than our bodies and each other and God belonging to us as a sort of private property that we get to own. And so what's important about coming to church, if this isn't explicit already, is not just like do it and God will be happy with you, which is not what I'm saying at all, but that this liturgy teaches you how to live every other day. Because we come here, we pray. We step into worship where we give our attention to God and see the world in God's light. Then we commune with each other. We step into each other's lives. We hopefully learn something about God and each other. And then we take the Eucharist, we die to ourselves and receive God's love. And then we go back out into the world. We can map that liturgy onto our daily lives. And so the last thing I want to say is that idolatry protects us from the darkness of God. Because the Israelites were invited to come up on the mountain, and they decided not to. They said, Moses, go up instead of us. And Moses is in the darkness where it looks scary and terrifying. Darkness usually is where we think of God as absent. And so they manufactured something that protected them from the darkness of God, from absence, loneliness, contemplation. And so if you genuinely desire union with the unspeakable love of God, then you must be prepared to have your religious world shattered. You must be prepared to have the rituals that you've made destroyed so that you can enter into the unknowing mystery of God. And so do you feel, perhaps in some area of your life or all of it, like God is gone? Or that love is absent? Or that everything you thought was wrong and everything's been upturned? Every conception, presupposition is now gone. And what this story teaches us is that that is actually precisely where God is. And we just have to be brave enough and courageous enough to trust that darkness, that mystery, and that unknowing. And so to be at home with God, since they're on their way home, this is what the promised land is. To be at home with God, with yourself, with each other, even with the land, is to live a truly human life. And we need what God gives us on Sinai to return home. And so God, in the deepest part of who you are, wants to free you from constructs and falsities of who he is and fictional humanities and the images of ourselves that we so desperately try to protect. So as T.S. Eliot said, one of my favorite poets, he said, "Let the darkness come upon you, which shall be the darkness of God." Let the darkness come upon you, which shall be the darkness of God. So let's just slow down for a second, enter a time of prayer before the band comes back up. And just think in your life for a second, something you're using to protect yourself, something you're using to give yourself an identity that you've created, an obstruction to the darkness and sometimes the unexpected love of God. And just locate something in your life. Take a deep breath and just say, I surrender this. I surrender this. Then just breathe in and say, I will let you be who you are, so that I may be who I am. God, we come before you today, scared, wanting to protect ourselves, so easily turning to distractions and amusements and replacements. But we come to you wanting to desire your love. Teach us how to desire. give us new liturgies as gifts, not works to earn, but gifts to be enjoyed, so that we may see who you are and see each other. May we not become like idols, deaf to the needs of a person next to us, and mute to words of love that we need to say. I pray that you would just rush into our life and free us from anything that prevents the dream that you would have for us. Show us your love, even if it looks like a storm on a mountain.